All right, so this evening is part two of our look at the Dead Sea Scrolls. This evening, we're going to talk about the actual scrolls themselves. So last week, we looked at the history of their discovery and then up to the forgeries of this present day. Very brief history of about 50 years. Tonight, we're going to look at what documents were discovered and a few interesting things in those documents that were discovered in the caves. And then next week, we're going to talk about the people who made these scrolls or collected these scrolls. Who are the Essenes? What do we know about them? And then the last 2 weeks, we'll talk about how the Dead Sea Scrolls actually intersect with the Old Testament. What do we learn about our Hebrew Bible as a result of the Dead Sea Scrolls? So first, let's remember the basics of the historical context of what to expect to find in the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Dead Sea Scrolls are 2,000 years old. So we're looking at these archaeological sites that are much, much older than anything we're going to find in American history. The scrolls were written between the years of 200 or maybe 250 BC up until probably about the time period of the life of Christ. So we're talking about a 200 to 300 year time period in which they were written, since the last ones were written at around the time of Jesus Christ's life. We're going to expect that these scrolls will have minimal impact on the New Testament and Christianity existing in the world after the ministry of Christ. So if anything, the insight that we're going to get from the Dead Sea Scrolls as far as understanding the world of the Bible is that it's going to teach us more so about the opponents of Jesus Christ. That is those who opposed him, the Pharisees, Sadducees, priestly class. Those are going to be the type of groups that we'll be more likely to learn about, simply because the church didn't exist in the time period when the Dead Sea Scrolls were written, and those groups were around during that time period. Now, most of the scrolls in Hebrew, there's a scattering of scrolls that are written in Aramaic or Greek, and we call them the Dead Sea Scrolls, but you'll see when we put the pictures of these various scrolls on the screen, a lot of them are fragments and scraps. Now, we believe that there are in total 950 different manuscripts. That doesn't mean it's 950 different works, because, for instance, there are multiple copies of Isaiah, there's multiple copies of the Community Rule, and we'll talk about a couple other books that you have multiple copies of. They were discovered in 12 different caves, and again, whenever we talk about the scrolls and the numbers that we have, we're always going to be approximate, because, reading these fragments sometimes is more of an art than a science, trying to discern what's written in them. So we can take the 950 different manuscripts that were found in Qumran that the Essenes had gathered together, and we can divide these manuscripts into three major categories. So the Dead Sea Scrolls can be divided into categories of biblical manuscripts, apocryphal manuscripts, and sectarian manuscripts. So these are the three different categories that all the groups are in: biblical, apocryphal, sectarian, and now we'll talk about what each of those three groups are. So first, the biblical manuscripts. Out of the 950 manuscripts that we have, about 200 of them are copies of various parts of the Hebrew Bible. And this is the most important aspect of the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, because before the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, the oldest manuscript of the Hebrew Bible was the Leningrad Codex. You can see up on the screen the first pages of the Leningrad Codex. And the Leningrad Codex was produced in the 11th century. So the Dead Sea Scrolls are approximately 1,300 years older than our previous oldest copy of the Hebrew Bible. Before, if they were looking into maybe older copies of the Old Testament, they would look at the Greek Septuagint, because the Hebrews were good at, when a Hebrew manuscript got beyond its time of use and began to decay, they'd have a ceremony where they would destroy the Hebrew manuscript. So we didn't have any for all those hundreds of years. But the Dead Sea Scrolls allow us to bridge that gap. At times, we're able to get surprisingly close to the original dating of some of the later books of the Hebrew Bible. And this, I would say, is a mammoth discovery for the church, but turns out to be, I would say, from the world's perspective, rather inconsequential. And we'll talk about why the biblical manuscripts end up being rather inconsequential. The real stunner, though, was not only did we find manuscripts of the Hebrew Bible, but it wasn't just that we have manuscripts of a few books of the Hebrew Bible, but we actually have every book of the Bible represented in the Dead Sea Scrolls other than one. So out of all the books of the Old Testament, every single one was found in the Dead Sea Scrolls other than one singular book. Anybody want to hazard a guess if there's any book that's not going to be found in the Dead Sea Scrolls? What book would be it? It's logical when you think about what it is. Esther. Esther is the one book that we don't find in the Dead Sea Scrolls. They believe there's a couple of reasons why. First, Esther doesn't mention God by name, and so they see it as a lesser book because God isn't mentioned by name. But what is probably the more likely reason why the Essenes wouldn't bother to collect the book of Esther is that Esther is the background for the Jewish feast of Purim. We've celebrated Purim here in our church. It's a fun festival. One of the reasons it's fun is for the Jewish community. Purim's kind of like the modern day Halloween. Everybody dresses up. They have a good time. They eat lots of food. It's just a wonderful time of rejoicing. And if you know anything about the Essenes, we'll talk a lot more about them next week. The Essenes aren't big on partying, aren't big on dressing up. Everything that Purim is, the Essenes are not. So not only do they not celebrate Purim, they kind of opposed it in the way that you might have some Christians today oppose Christmas or oppose Easter. They opposed Purim. So the fact that they rejected the feast of Purim is probably the larger reason as to why they would not have a copy of Purim in the Qumran community. But like I said, all of this stuff is a little like, are you sure you really don't have a copy of this? Because there's always things that you kind of got to wink at whether or not this is actually there or not. And I say that because there are some scholars who believe that we have discovered the book of Esther in Qumran. And this is where I say you always have to be like, are you really sure you've discovered what you're saying you've discovered for some of this stuff? Because here you see on this screen, this is the picture of the document that they say is the book of Esther. You can see the letters on the, I guess it's your right-hand side that they say are represented by that manuscript. But the funny thing is that the letters that are in brackets are not actually on the manuscript, but those are the letters that are supplied by the archaeologists. So if you look through what's actually you can read on that manuscript, the letters on the manuscript are a vav. So a one letter, the sort of there, it's W, it's pronounced W-O-W, but we pronounce it va. One va, then you have two blank lines, another va, and then you have a blank line, and then you have a lamed. So that manuscript has 4 letters and 3 blank lines on it. And they're like, oh, we've discovered the book of Esther. And that's caused other scholars to be like, yeah, I'm not so sure about that. And I think I would fall into that category of saying, we probably don't have the book of Esther in Purim. But I wanted to put that manuscript up and show that as an example of some of the difficulty of trying to determine, do we actually have this book? And sometimes they're kind of reaching at straws to try to discover this. But the significant thing is that we have portions or entire books, even entire books with commentary on every other book of the Hebrew Bible. And this covers a little over 200 of the 950 documents. Along with copies of the Bible itself, we also have commentaries on the Bible. The most well-preserved of the commentary is the Pesher Habakkuk. Now, the word Pesher simply means its meaning. So it's titled, it's the meaning of Habakkuk. So the commentary on Habakkuk doesn't so much comment on the meaning of the text as we do in modern commentaries today, where we try to bridge the gap and explain this is what this would have meant in Habakkuk's life, this is who Chaldeans are, and so forth, where we explain all of those type of details. The commentaries in Qumran were more focused on straight application for their own day. For instance, Habakkuk. The main purpose of Habakkuk is the prophet of Habakkuk sees all the injustice going on in Jewish society. He sees how awful the king of Judah is at that time period. And Habakkuk's like, Lord, won't you do something about how terrible this time period is? And Habakkuk responds, oh, yeah, I am going to do something about it. I'm going to send the Babylonians to come in and judge Judah for their sins and what they have done. And then that ends up happening at the hands of Nebuchadnezzar. But the commentary from Qumran is largely focused on the goings-on in their time period. So the commentary talks about how the Romans are the second coming of the Babylonians or the Chaldeans. They immediately tie the Babylonians to the Romans of their own day. They're talking about internal religious struggles in Jerusalem and the temple priesthood. And they're part of, reading this, I'm sure scholars thought, oh, we're going to learn so much about the priesthood and about the struggles of that time period. The problem is they don't name anybody by name. Like they talk about the wicked priest. They talk about the man of lies. And it's pretty sure if you were living in that time period, you would know who the wicked priest was that they were referring to, who the man of lies was that they were referring to, but sadly, we do not today. Now, I'm going to show a little video from the Israel Museum and the Shrine of the Book. The video is meant to encourage people to go online and study the Pasher Habakkuk online because they have a really great ability to look at it in detail, a digital version of it, and to study everything about it. The problem is I'm sure most people don't do it because you need to know ancient Hebrew to study it, and that's a pretty small group. But they made this little video to encourage people to do this. But what the video does is it shows one of the scholars at the Shrine of the Book walk into the museum and then walk through the little tunnel and then walk to the place where they had the actual Habakkuk Pesher on display at the museum. It's not there anymore because, as I mentioned last week, they've put those all in storage since 2023 because of the violence in Israel right now. But I thought it'd be interesting for you to see what it would look like if you visited the Shrine of the Book and went to see it before they put the manuscripts in storage.
We're in the Shrine of the Book, and this is the tunnel which connects the main entrance to the hall wherein the world famous Dead Sea Scrolls are in display. Come and see. Thousands of visitors from all over the world. They come to see the original scrolls. And one of them is a unique copy of a scroll called the Commentary of the words of the prophet Habakkuk, one of the prophets of Israel. The real prophet lived 2,600 years ago. And what we have in these scrolls is a very old interpretation of the words of the prophet Habakkuk. What actually the prophet meant when he talked about the end of history. What kind of secrets are hidden in these scrolls? The Qumranites tried to explain the special meanings of the Habakkuk prophecies, and these prophecies are contained in these scrolls. Here we have the original scroll on display, and you have the chance to read the prophet and his words through the internet version of the prophet Habakkuk.
So you can again see here how they kind of build up stuff to make it out to be more than it is in the way that they talk about the Dead Sea Scrolls. You talk about kind of end of the world prophecies and stuff like this. But when you read the actual commentary, he's talking about how he's interpreting Habakkuk to be all about his own time period and the priests of his day and the Romans, and so it's very different than what he says in the video. So it's interesting how people try to make these out to be more. But if you were to go to visit the Shrine of the Book and see where they had these, that would be the type of image. It's kind of cool to go in because they make it like you're walking into a cave, so you kind of get that simulated there. And if you notice, the the large cylinder in the middle of that room is a complete facsimile of the great Isaiah scroll. And that huge circular cylinder is designed for you to see the entire scroll laid out. They've never actually put the real one in there because they don't want to store it in that manner, but you have a real, perfect recreation of it there in the middle of the museum. So those are the biblical manuscripts that you find in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Next, we have the Apocryphal manuscripts. These are Jewish works that were not included in the Jewish canon. Some were previously known, some are what you would find in the Catholic Bible, and others were discovered for the very first time. This is also the category that we place the books under that are called the pseudepigrapha. The pseudepigrapha books are similar to the apocryphal books, but the pseudepigraphal books get their name because they all have a title of an ancient biblical character that we know didn't write the book. Like everybody who reading it knows that that person didn't write the book, but the book is told from that character's perspective. And so pseudepigraphal means, a lying about your name. And so it's right there in the name of it. And so we have various apocryphal books and pseudepigraphal books. The most prominent of all the books in this category is the Book of Enoch. Now, before the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, what we knew about the Book of Enoch was that it was in some way important in the intertestamental time, but we had no idea how important it was in the intertestamental period until we discovered the Dead Sea Scrolls. The oldest and only ancient copy that we had of Enoch before the Dead Sea Scrolls was an Ethiopian translation of Enoch that was translated from a Greek translation of Enoch. So it was translated from two languages. The Dead Sea Scrolls contain 10 Aramaic copies of the Book of Enoch. So we believe that the Book of Enoch was originally written in Aramaic. The oldest of the copies of the Book of Enoch go back to the 3rd century BC. And so sort of the competition, what is the oldest manuscript in the Dead Sea Scrolls? It's either the oldest copy of the Book of Enoch or the Great Isaiah Scroll. Those are the two oldest manuscripts that we've discovered that we can tell based on dating and, manuscript. The Hebrew language changed a little bit during the intertestamental period, so it's using the older type letters that they had during that time period. On the same thing, Aramaic went through some changes as well. So the Book of Enoch and the Great Isaiah Scroll are the oldest books. So what we know now is that the Book of Enoch was very popular. The fact that it had 10 different copies in the Dead Sea Scrolls is huge. It's expensive to make these copies. And so they put tons of emphasis upon it. It was also very influential in Jewish views regarding angels and the nature of heaven, and to some extent what they end up believing among the Essenes regarding the Messiah. We also see a couple references that relate to the Book of Enoch in the New Testament. Jude verses 14 and 15, and 2 Peter chapter 2 verse 1. Both of those books, I think, have to allude to the Book of Enoch. Like if you read the Book of Enoch, you read those verses and you're like, Jude and Peter are definitely looking back to the Book of Enoch. And when you see its popularity in the Dead Sea Scrolls, you're like, well, this was just a common work that everybody knew about during that time period. So it's not shocking that Jude and Peter would refer to that. That doesn't mean the Book of Enoch is inspired. It doesn't mean that everything in it is correct. There are some very wrong things in the Book of Enoch. The most wrong of all the things in the Book of Enoch is that talking about the Messiah, the Book of Enoch claims that Enoch is the Messiah. That's one of their main claims in that book. And so it's got some stuff that's off, some stuff that's wrong, but Jude and Peter definitely refer to that book in those two letters of the New Testament. We also discovered a new work in the Book of Enoch, and that is the Book of Enoch had, we'd probably call it an appendix today, attached to the end of it in the copies of the Dead Sea Scrolls, and it was the Book of Giants. The Book of Giants told about the stories of how the sons of God, angels, had offspring with women, and then the offspring of angels and women grew up to be giants. And then those giants, when they got killed by God in the flood, those giants became demons. So it turns out in the intertestamental period, demons are not fallen angels. Demons are the Nephilim, the descendants of angels and women after they die. That ends up becoming the demonic beings. That's something that we didn't know that Jews believed until we made these discoveries. The next most important of these apocryphal books is the one that was mentioned last week that everybody wanted to get their hands on, and that is the Genesis Apocryphon. By the way, I thought that this was a AI picture when I first found this online. It just looks too sharp to be real. And then I ended up finding like the original black and white version of it. And so somebody took a black and white picture and just colorized it, sharpened it up a little bit. So that's actually a real picture of the Genesis Apocryphon after they unrolled the entire thing and were able to study it. So yeah, I thought that was fake, but it turns out that that is a real picture. The Genesis Apocryphon, which is 4 sheets of leather that you see there, and it contains a fanciful conversation between Lamech and Noah before the flood. And it also tells some narratives of the life of Abraham that aren't present in the Bible. One of the things the Genesis Apocryphon loved to talk about was how beautiful Sarah was, and about how her beauty was just well known throughout the entire world and the most beautiful woman who had ever lived. And the Genesis Apocryphon is written in the style of the book of Enoch. And a lot of people believe that, somebody saw the popularity of the book of Enoch and how that was getting spread on. And they were like, I want a sequel like Hollywood today. And the Genesis Apocryphon is kind of like a sequel to the book of Enoch. They also found the testaments of the 12 patriarchs. So the testaments of the 12 patriarchs, this tells the story of the 12 sons of Jacob that right before they died, they gave exhortations to all their sons that were very similar to the last words of Jacob or Israel when he was on his deathbed. And these 12 stories tell a few new narratives, but they're more about providing moral advice for those who read them. So the church fathers knew about the stories of the 12 patriarchs. They wrote about them in early church writings. That's how we knew about their existence, and they talked about what was in them. But we finally found the actual manuscripts and saw the documents for the first time, thanks to the Dead Sea Scrolls. Other apocryphal works that were found in the caves of Qumran are the works of Ben Syria, or the Wisdom of Ben Syria, a book that's very much like Proverbs, the book of Tobit, which some of you have probably heard the story of Tobit before, the Epistle of Jeremiah, which is more prophecies of Jeremiah, the book of Judith, the book of Jubilee, and then there are extensions to the book of Daniel, which we have in our Apocrypha today, and then also extensions to the book of Jeremiah. Were also found in that time period. But overall, I think the biggest discovery of finding all of these apocryphal works is that we learned just how important the angelic and the demonic world was to this intertestamental period of time, and how it just was a real obsession and a fascination with a lot of the Jews during this time period, this battle between the angels and the demons, and everything that it would mean for that time period. So when Paul talks about powers and principalities, I'll talk about it actually. It's weird that this is this Wednesday and then the passage I'm preaching out in Ephesians 1 on Sunday. But when Paul talks about powers, principalities, forces, we know because of these documents and other things that Paul is clearly talking about angelic beings and demonic forces. And so when you see scholars say about these that they're not human kings, they're angels, well, because of all these documents, we know they were obsessed with angels. And so it was a big deal for Paul to talk about how Jesus is above those powers and principalities. And I think that's also why at the beginning of the letter of Hebrews, they spend so much, the author of Hebrews spends a couple of chapters talking about how Jesus is superior to the angels, because they were such a fascination in this time period, and we've learned a lot of that through the Dead Sea Scrolls. But for most of the scholars, and I would say this is biblical and secular, for them the most important documents were not the biblical documents, they were not the apocryphal documents. I think for the average person, especially people who are like watching YouTube videos and stuff like that, the apocryphal stuff's the most like valuable. Like people love talking about the book of Enoch. It's a big obsession for a lot of people. But for a lot of scholars, the most fascinating part of the collection of the Dead Sea Scrolls is the third category, and that falls under the Sectarian category. The Sectarian category are the documents that talk about the intellectual and spiritual experiences of those who lived in the Qumran community. So these are the documents that are about the basis of how they lived, of what they thought was important. Now, any honest take would say that the most important founding document to the Essenes, the people at Qumran, would be the Hebrew Bible. I mean, they had 200 some odd copies of the Hebrew Bible in those scrolls. They probably had even more when they had their downfall. And we'll talk about that downfall next week. But the Sectarian documents tell us why the Essenes were so passionate about their own flavor of Judaism. We need to remember that the Essenes were so passionate about their view of Jewish culture and Jewish life that many of them fled to live into the desert and to live separate from the community. I know that we here in the church, we are passionate about Christianity. We're passionate about the gospel, but I don't think any of us are going to respond to the secular push of our culture by going to live out in the swamps in the bayou. We're not, maybe Kenny's going to. He's like, that's my home, it's where I found my wife. I'm comfortable there. And he'll go out into that area. But this is why they were so passionate about their life that they abandoned society. The main document of the Sectarian documents is the one that you see on the screen, the Community Rule. The Community Rule is a document, obviously, on their rules, and it has two appendices called the Rule of the Congregation and the Rule of Blessing. They talk a lot about a war that is going on between good and evil, and if you want to survive that war between good and evil, the way to survive it is to be separate, to separate yourself from the evil and to separate yourself to the good. So they were all about being separate from the pollutants of their society. So the ideals of the community are set out in the document. Certain rituals were required to enter the community. There's a covenant that you have to make to be part of the Qumran community and to be considered an Essene. They took that covenant very important. You had to repeat the covenant and renew it every single year. And a lot of the center of the document, though, is speaking on their dualistic beliefs. So this belief of the war that's always going on between the Lord and the sons of God and the demonic. And there are a collection of rules, oaths. They also have administrative issues. And then there are a lot of references to a true spiritual temple, because they believe that the community in Jerusalem is corrupt. They believe that Herod's temple has been abandoned by God. They believe it's been given over to Gentiles. They would go as far as to say, if you're worshiping in Herod's temple, you're a Gentile, because you're, colluding with the Gentiles and you have left the Jewish community and you've become one of them. And then the community rule ends with a hymn of praise to the Lord. It's also the community rule that speaks of messianic expectations. And you've probably heard in a sermon at least some point, I think I probably have mentioned it before, about a view on the Messiah that they only had in Qumran, that we only know about. I didn't realize we discovered this because of the community rule and wouldn't know about this without this. But there was a view for the Essenes that they needed two Messiahs. And we learned about this in the community rule. They need two Messiahs. They need a priestly Messiah. This is who they call a Messiah of Aaron. And then they also needed a political Messiah. And this one they called the Messiah of Israel. And this is really intriguing for us because in a lot of ways, they're two Messiahs parallel what we believe for the two advents of Jesus. And that is, Jesus came first in a form of lowliness, born of a virgin. He served, he suffered, he died. He was the suffering servant. He was the Lamb of God. The author of Hebrews calls him our great high priest. And what was the offering that our great high priest brought to the Lord? It was the offering of himself. And then we also know from the New Testament that there's going to be a second ministry of Jesus, where he's going to come back in the likeness of which he ascended to heaven. And when he comes back, he will not come back as a virgin-born little baby. He will not come back to suffer and die for our sins. He will come back to conquer his enemies. He will come back to provide peace for his people. And he will come back to rule over the world. And so we have these two ministries of Jesus, but what we see in the Essenes' writings is that when they looked at the prophecies of the Messiah, they looked at how the Messiah would suffer. They looked at how the Messiah would rule. And they looked at these different ministries and they're like, one guy can't do all of this. And so their answer to that was, we need two Messiahs, which to me shows that I think we're right in line with how we take the prophecies of the Old Testament. The New Testament is right in line with how it takes the prophecies of the Old Testament, because the Qumran community shows us that when you look at all those prophecies of the Old Testament, you have to see two radically different ministries. And to them, the only way they could make sense of it was to have two Messiahs. But we know there aren't two Messiahs. There's one Messiah who has two comings. And that's the difference of it. We had Jesus' first advent, and then they will have the second. So I see their two Messiahs to be sort of like a forerunner, precursor, trying to really hard to make sense of these prophecies. And then you see how Jesus fulfills them in a way that is perfect for how he will do it, but is different from their expectations, although he will fulfill it all. So I think that's one of the sort of fascinating things that comes out of the community rule. The next Sectarian document is the Temple Scroll. The Temple Scroll was written in the style of the book of Deuteronomy. Most of the Temple Scroll has God speaking in the first person. And the majority of the Temple Scroll, which is why they've named it this, is God providing Israel with a remarkably sophisticated description on a plan to build a new, pure temple to replace the temple that currently resides in Jerusalem. So scholars say that this temple that's in the Temple Scroll, you could say it's a fusion of the tabernacle, Solomon's temple, Ezekiel's temple, with a little dash of what for them was modern architecture and Hellenistic architecture. So, but it's mostly taking the tabernacle, Solomon's temple, Ezekiel's temple, and trying to make them into one temple structure. And then there's also additional laws in the Temple Scroll because Essenes always need more laws and more rules. And so you find more of those in the Temple Scroll, and it's similar to what we see in Deuteronomy 12 through 23. One of the things that I think is interesting in the Temple Scroll is that they also have several prayer books and hymn books and Thanksgiving psalm books. What's interesting is that their psalm books, some of them contain some psalms that are in our Bible. They also contain psalms that we've never seen before. So there are 100 of the 150 psalms that are in our Bibles found in the Dead Sea Scrolls, but there are 300 psalms that have been discovered in the Dead Sea Scrolls. So that means 200 of these psalms were songs that they had written in the intertestamental period that no one knew about before. I don't think I've read anyone who suggested that we should, truck 200 new psalms into the Bible. We take them as, songs that were for that time period that weren't inspired. But it's interesting to see that they had these song books that were their own. They probably use them as song books, probably use them for chanting and prayers. And it was kind of this mixture of biblical psalms, their own songs that they were written, that they put together in books for them to praise and worship the Lord. So it's just kind of intriguing that there's these new songs there. And I mean, maybe part of one of the reasons that we're never going to include these in Scripture is that in some of the songs, there are magic spells for casting out demons. If you remember in the book of Acts, in Acts chapter 19, you have the 7 sons of Sceva who are trying to cast out demons. And the demons end up being like, I know Paul and I know Jesus, but I don't know you. And they beat him up and send him out naked. A lot of people believe that discovering these magic chants in these scrolls probably gives us background into what these type of exorcists of that time period would have been using when they were trying to cast out those demons. But yeah, so we're never going to include these in our Bible because it's got stuff like that in them. And then we have the scroll that is known as the End of Days, or the War Scroll, or the long title, The War of the Sons of Light and the Sons of Darkness. This is their apocalyptic end of history writing. So this is their equivalent to our book of Revelation. So they believed that they were living in the end times. They also believed that all of humanity was divided into two categories that were predetermined by God. And everybody was either born as a son of the Prince of Darkness, or you were born into the category of being a son of righteousness. So in the Essenes' mind, everybody's life is predetermined from birth. Like you are born as a son of darkness or as a son of light. And maybe some of the humor for that for today is that it was considered that if you were political in any way, and if you were part of the government, you were automatically a prince of darkness. like we know you're on the bad side because you're in the government. So they automatically put them on to that side. So they believe everybody was predetermined, born into one of two camps. Mormons actually have a very similar view of the end times and separating people into two camps in the way that we find in the War Scroll. A lot of Gnosticism is very similar in the way that they divide and have election in the dividing of people from birth. But the end of days, what it talks about is how the sons of righteousness, the Qumran community, would one day be mobilized into troops. And so a lot of the War Scroll is talking about these divisions of troops that the Essenes will one day end up making up. And the vast majority of Essenes were men. So, this is probably how they got their manly, we're going to be great soldiers here. It talks about their division of troops. It talks about their weaponry. And it talks about how there will be a final war. And that final war will have a series of 7 battles. And then at the 7th and final battle, that is the point where the angelic and demonic forces will join in the battle. And when they do, the angelic forces will become physical. They will overwhelm the mankind, the sons of the Prince of Darkness, those members of mankind who are on the side of evil. They will overwhelm them and then usher in the new Jerusalem and a recreation of the world. And maybe the most interesting thing, though, about the War Scroll is that while the Essenes talk a lot about the Messiah and having a political Messiah in the community rule, there is no mention of the Messiah in the War Scroll. So in the War Scroll, you have the end of days conflict that takes place between angels and demons and man. New Jerusalem comes in, and there is no mention of the Messiah at all in their apocalypse, which I think is rather weird with some of the other things that they mentioned. You would assume the political Messiah would take center stage in that, but he's not mentioned at all. And now we have the most boring part of the Scrolls of Qumran. So if you found this to be boring so far, it's about to get a whole lot more boring at this point. And that is the calendar text. Oh, the calendar text. Who doesn't want to read books and scrolls that are all about calendars? We are so blessed today to live in a world with only one major calendar, but there were several active calendars in use leading up to the time of Jesus Christ and also during his lifetime. And Qumran, the Essenes, they thought that they had discovered and concocted what would be the best of all calendars. And that is a solar calendar where you would have years that are 364 days long. Each month of the calendar is 30 years, and it's 30 days. Each month is 30 days, and then they add 4 days at different months depending on how they need to line it up with the sun and the moon and so forth. But Qumran was very passionate about their calendar, and to be frank, when you read about it, it makes a lot of sense. If you would have accept their calendar, you would have fixed dates for all the holidays. If you notice right now with all the Jewish holidays, they're on the lunar calendar, and so they rotate. That's why Easter's early some years, it's late other years. And the Essenes were like, we don't need that. We don't need to have Passover moving around. We all have a fixed date on it. On top of that, by fixing the dates of all the festivals, None of the major festivals would ever fall on a Sabbath. And apparently, if you read the Talmud and the Midrash and those documents, what you end up discovering is that one of the biggest debates and disagreements and worries and frets among the Jewish community has always been, what do we do when the festival lands on the Sabbath? Like, how can we do all of the sacrifices with the Day of Atonement? I mean, you know, you read through the Day of Atonement, a lot of work needs to go into the Day of Atonement to set that up and offer the sacrifices and send the animals out. You got to have the priest's clothes perfectly clean. They have to, you know, sprinkle blood on stuff all over the place. There's lots of stuff going on with the Day of Atonement. It's not rest. So what do you do on the Day of Rest and the Day of Atonement are the same day? And so how do you handle that? And so the Essenes were like, oh, we know how we're going to handle it. We're going to have our awesome solar calendar. And none of these festivals will ever land on the Sabbath day again. And so they thought this was ideal. Sort of the other interesting thing about their calendar is that they wrote a lot about the priestly courses. And the priestly courses are the schedules when the priests are to serve at the Temple of Jerusalem. And they laid out how the household should serve in what order and what period of time of the year, which is really weird because, like, they broke away from all the households. They saw them all as pagans because they're involved in the temple time right now. So it's like they have nothing to do with this. And yet they spent so much time in their documents writing about how these priesthoods that they thought are corrupt, how they should have their schedules for serving in the temple. Now, these calendars, though, also do point out one important thing when it comes to determining when events happen in the Bible, and especially in the time of Jesus Christ. And that is these calendars, their calendar text allows us to discover the difficulty of determining and discerning what date and what year Jesus died on. Knowing, did Jesus die on a Wednesday or a Thursday? What day in the early 30s did he most likely die in? Also, controversies over what type of meal Jesus ate with the disciples at the Last Supper. There's some controversy over whether or not they ate a Passover Seder or whether it was a different meal connected to the Passover. What did they actually eat? And sometimes reading this stuff, it's like, how can we not know? How can we not know what year? How can we not know what day of the week it is? How can we not know what type of meal it is? Well, the reason we don't know a lot of this stuff is because there were all these competing calendars that different people were using at this time. And Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, none of them are like, oh, by the way, I'm using this calendar when I'm writing my stuff. And John's never like, oh, well, I'm using a different calendar than Matthew, Mark, and Luke. That's why my stuff may look a little different, because I'm looking at it from a different perspective of a different calendar. The Romans had their calendars. The priests had their calendars. The Pharisees had their calendars. The Essenes had their calendars. And so when we look at it hundreds of years later, it appears that no one really was overly concerned precisely when Jesus died, probably for a few hundred years into church history. So by the time they start to look into it, we're so far removed from it. They had these different calendars that they used. A lot of them are defunct by the time we're concerned about that. And we don't even know about their existence until stuff like this. So the fact that we don't know what year Jesus died on, or days of the week, or all of that, it shouldn't be surprising, because they use these different competing calendars. We don't know what calendars the disciples or the apostles would have used. So this is one of those things where it comes to when Jesus died and all of those things that we just have to chalk up to say, we don't know. And to be honest, I would love to really know. The reason I would love to really know is it's 2025. And you know what it means if it's 2025? We're really close to 2,000 years from when Jesus died. And I would love to know what the 2,000th year anniversary is for multiple reasons. Like, I'd love to celebrate it. I'd also love to begin to plan, like, trips to Israel for that time, for the 200,000th anniversary, make it public to everybody else, and then charge extra bucks to go over there and make a ton of money on it. Maybe that's why God doesn't want us to know, because he doesn't want people like me to be like, let's figure out how to make some extra money on it. But I'm sure you could make tons on it. But yeah, so this is part of the reason why the dates are difficult for knowing when Jesus died, is that the calendars are just tough. One of the books that I got, I probably got it like 10, 15 years ago, and it was just translations of the Dead Sea Scrolls. And I was like, this is going to be so interesting, And I started reading it, and the first thing I started to read was the calendar text. And I was like, this is the most boring thing I've ever read in my entire life. This is awful. So that sort of plays in, though, to some of the dating in the New Testament. But the one thing I want to make sure that we just caution when it comes to the Dead Sea Scrolls, now that we've gone over what you can find in most of them, is to remember that if someone says we have discovered this remarkable teaching from the Dead Sea Scrolls, these amazing prophecies we never knew about before, if they make talking about the Dead Sea Scrolls seem like it's something you'd see on the History Channel at 2 a.m. in the middle of the night, you know, the History Channel is at 1 a.m., they're going to all of a sudden talk about how it was aliens who helped the Egyptians build the pyramids back in ancient Egypt. And then the next episode's going to be the prophecies of the Dead Sea Scrolls. If you hear that kind of stuff, there are a lot of interesting things, I would say, in the Dead Sea Scrolls. A lot of interesting things. You learn about some of the religious thought, the views on angels and so forth at that time period, but there's not these mind-blowing, amazing prophecies. It's funny, when I was trying to look up an image to put on the screen when I talk about the calendar. So I did a Google search on the calendars of Essenes, and the first things that come up are book covers. And the book covers are about the world-shaking prophecies of the calendars of the Essenes. And as someone who actually read those, I'm like, no, that kind of stuff's not in there. I'm sorry. It's really boring. There are no world-shaking prophecies. You're just making stuff out of nowhere. So this is just kind of similar to last week's ending point, which is there's a lot of really fascinating stuff in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And I love that there are stories that they told in the intertestamental period that we didn't know before. And now we found them, that when the early church fathers talked about the stories of the 12 patriarchs, now we have that document. Like there's cool things like that. The stuff about the two messiahs, I think, is great because to me that sort of, you know, helps to provide a little bit of evidence that our view on the two advents of Christ isn't coming up out of nowhere, that the church just made up. Like there's reasons for why we have these views based on what's found in the Old Testament. So there's some cool stuff there, but this sort of, you know, blow your mind type stuff is not what we find in the Dead Sea Scrolls. So I hope that helps you to know what is in those scrolls. This was probably I think this is going to be the most difficult part of my research for this because I was just surprised. I couldn't find anybody online who had a singular list of here are the different manuscripts that you find in the Dead Sea Scrolls. I just thought that would have been something that's out there, and I had to pick from here and there and there and there to pile this together. But so there are the Dead Sea Scrolls, and next week we're going to talk about the Essenes and their world in the desert.